We have Gestalt principles. These are principles or laws that would determine what we see or make of things or situations that we met, one of which is the law of proximity. It states that elements that are closer together will be perceived as coherent objects. Let's take a look at the examples. On the left, we have here three groups of circles, one of which is three horizontal rows of circles, another is two horizontal rows of circles, and the other one has three columns of circles. Another one, we have the before and after face of a group of circles. Sa before, makita na to nga buo pa sila, meaning connected pa sila. And then ato silang gilagyo, nagama ta og duha ka group na, which is the group of two columns of circles, and another group of two columns of circles. So when objects we are perceiving are near each other, bali dool, we perceive them as belonging together. So the second one is the law of similarity. It states that elements that look similar will be perceived as part of the same form. In the example we have here, there seems to be a triangle in the square, and there seems to be a circle in the square also. Now we link similar elements together. Kung unsa iyang porma atong i-match sa iyang kapariha. The third law or principle is the law of closure. Now we tend to fill the gaps or close the figures we perceive. We enclose a space by completing a contour and ignoring gaps in the figure. Now take a look at the example given. We have here triangle nga wala gi close siya, but sa ato ang mind is we tend to fill the gaps nga mahimo siyang triangle. Ang isa is para makabuo ta og airplane, para mabuo siya nga ball of soccer ball, and ang isa is para mahimo jud siya nga as in closed circle and closed square. Mo na siya law of closure. Another is the law of good continuation. Individuals have the tendency to continue contours whenever the elements of the pattern establish an implied direction. Now, people tend to draw a good continuous line. In this example, we have here this. Sa example, makita na to nga na arrow, meaning i-continue na siya hantod sa hangtod. Wala na limit, bisan asa na nimo moabot, and pa-up napoy pa down. So the mind continues visual patterns, the eye continues in the direction it is going, and the principle of continuity predicts the preference for continuous figures.
So for the continuation of the different principles under the Gestalt psychology or the Gestalt theory, we are down in the fifth principle, which is the law of good pregnance. So this law or the law of pregnance is also known as the law of good figure. So the stimulus here will be organized into as good a figure as possible. This means that when you are presented with a group of ambiguous or complex objects, your brain will simplify them as much or simpler as possible. In simple terms, this law tells us that people perceive complex things as simplistic form in order to recognize the environment easily. This makes humans understand what they see as a whole rather than small pieces or the sum of total parts. To provide an example, I present you these following photos that serve as an illustration or representation of the fifth principle, which is the law of pregnance. Are you familiar with this first picture? So this first photo is usually seen in the field of sports. So this photo is what we call the logo of the Olympic game or the Olympic tournament. Do you know that Olympic logo is a collection of curved lines, the curved lines that connected from each other to form an Olympic logo. So instead of seeing this logo as complex object that collects the curved line, we perceive in our mind what we see is an overlapping circles that overlap from each other to form the Olympic logo. So instead of looking for its complexity, we perceive it as a simple ones. So earlier before, we defined that the law of pregnance is when you are presented with an ambiguous or complex object, we perceive it as a simple or simpler form as possible. And now we are down in the last principle under the Gestalt psychology or the Gestalt theory, which is called the law of figure ground. So it is stated here that we tend to pay attention and perceive things in the foreground first. According to the figure ground principle, people extensively perceive objects as being in the foreground or in background. They either stand out in the front as in the figure or recede into the back or the ground. And now I present you this following photos that illustrates the sixth or at the last principle under the Gestalt psychology, which is the law of figure ground. So one of the most common example of figure ground is the faces or vases illustration. I know that we are familiar with this photo because we usually see this in the different contexts or places. We'll just focus on this illustration, the second illustration, which is the faces and the vases, because the other photo is just similar, or they are just the same as this illustration. What we see depends on whatever we see, the white figure or the black figure. So to explain, when you see the white as the figure, so we can see or perceive a vase. So if you look at the black as the figure, then you'll notice two faces in profile.
Now you know the Gestalt principles, and they are not just mere principles of visual drawings or illustrations. These are also used in the teaching and learning process. So for the law of proximity, related concepts or lessons should be taught aligned or closely to each other. This is the reason why subtraction is taught after addition, multiplication after subtraction, then division after multiplication. Imagine teaching addition then jumping directly to polygons. Di ba lisod siya? For example, sa mga major nga math, dapat makahibaw may gunsaon pag-solve og algebra para di mi maglisod og unsaon pag-solve sa uban nga topics like parehas sa kanang naay calculus na mo karon. So for the law of similarity, similar lessons or contents should be grouped together to make learners develop understanding more perfectly and effectively. This is the reason why lessons are grouped into units. Unit 1 is for human body, Unit 2 is for energy, so on and so forth. Muna siya nga makita ka sa to ang libro na as mga chapter 1, chapter 2, nga na module 1, module 2. Kay lisod sad og dili na to i-group no magkabuag sa mas makalibog pa siya. Now for the law of closure, when a concept or topic is incomplete, thus isn't closed, incomplete information may make learners want to discover what's missing rather than concentrating on the given instruction. If students find a math algorithm confusing because a certain question is left unanswered or a step isn't clear, they will tend to concentrate on that focused part of the process rather than total process as a whole. This is why students get lost, thus make the lesson complete. Present it clearly, simply, and always be ready for students' clarification. Now, for the law of good continuation, lessons should be presented in such a way that learners will see this as connected and continuous. Now you know why we have the review part of the lesson plan. This way, students will realize that their new lesson actually has continuity and is related to what they already know or to the previous lesson.
So much for that, for the law of good pregnance states that when things are grasped at whole, the minimal amount of energy is exerted in thinking. In an instance, in the making of lesson plan, law of pregnance can be used to make the lesson holistic, complete, and most of all, simple. Lastly, for the law of figure ground, it states here that for a figure to be perceived, it must stand out from the background. Emphasis should be done on important aspect of the lesson. Law of figure ground can be used in situations like teachers should vary the tone of their voice or write boldly or underline the important keywords of the lesson upon the discussion.
In order to recall and to sum up the six Gestalt principles under the Gestalt psychology, let's try to enumerate them all. So the first principle is the law of proximity. The second is the law of similarity. Next is the law of closure. And next is the law of good continuation. Then the good pregnance. And last is the law of figure ground. For the insight learning, so learning takes place by discovery or insight. It was first developed by Wolfgang Kohler, in which he described experiments with apes, where the apes could use boxes and sticks as tools to solve problems. In each of these problems, the important aspect of learning was not reinforcement, but the coordination of thinking to create new organizations of materials. Learning to incorporate Gestalt visual perception principles into your design work, like any other psychological principle, can greatly improve the user experience. Understanding how the human brain works and then capitalizing on a person's natural tendencies results in a more seamless interaction that makes a user feel at ease. Gestalt principles are relatively simple to incorporate into almost any design. They can quickly elevate a design that appears haphazard or is fighting for a user attention to one that offers seamless, natural interaction that guides user towards the action they want to make.
Gestalt principles are not only influence perception, but they also impact on teaching and learning process. According to Kurt Lewin, who expounded Gestalt psychology through life space, said that an individual has inner and outer forces that affects his perceptions, expectation, as well as how he uses cognitive learning in all things.
Whereas inner forces includes own motivation, attitudes, and feelings, while outer forces includes the attitudes and behavior of teachers and the classmates.
Gestalt psychology helps us introduce the idea that humans' perception is not just about what they see or what they have experienced. It is also influenced with your motivations and expectation to the things around you. An Italian psychologist named Mario Polito expands and writes about the relevance of Gestalt psychology to the field of education. He said that Gestalt theory is found on the experience of contact that occurs here and now.
It considers with the interest the life space of a teachers as well as students. It takes interest in the complexity of experience without neglecting anything but accepting and amplifying all that emerges. It simulates learning as experience and the experience as a source of learning. It appreciates the affections and meaning that we attribute to what we learn. Knowledge is conceived as a continuous organization and rearrangement of information according to needs, purposes, and meanings. It asserts that learning is not accumulation, but remodeling or insight. Autonomy and freedom of the student is simulated by the teacher.
The main principle of Gestalt theory in teaching and learning processes are: first, teacher should encourage their students to discover the relationship of the elements that makes up a problem. 2. Incongruities, gaps, or disturbances are essential stimuli in a learning process. 3. Educational instruction should be based on the laws of organization.